Hollywood sold the dream of freedom, but behind the lights it was never free. For every star who rose, someone else was pulling the strings. The studios built empires, the mob funded them, and the stars lived trapped between the two. Some sought protection and found control. Some tried to escape and vanished. And a few, the ones who knew too much, learned that truth could be more dangerous than any lie. This is not the story of fame. It's the story of what fame cost. A story of stars, fixers, and the invisible power that shaped the golden age of Hollywood. Where beauty hid corruption and freedom always came with a price. Sammy Davis Jr., the price of protection. He called himself the world's greatest entertainer, and in many ways he was. Sammy Davis Jr. could sing, dance, act, play the drums, tell jokes. There was nothing he couldn't do. But in 1950s America, talent wasn't enough. Not when your skin was black, your girlfriend was white, and the stage you stood on was owned by men who measured worth in money and fear. Sammy learned early that Las Vegas wasn't built for people like him. He could headline the biggest casinos on the Strip, the Sands, the Flamingo, the Frontier. But after the applause faded, he had to leave through the back door. He couldn't stay in the hotels he performed in, couldn't use the pool, couldn't eat in the restaurants. To the audience, he was a star. To the city, he was still just colored. Then came the offer that changed everything. Sam Giancana, the powerful Chicago boss who ruled Vegas behind the curtain, liked Sammy. He saw profit in him. Protection, Giancana called it. A way to ensure the shows ran smooth. No threats, no protests, no cops hassling the casino owners for hiring a black man. And in return, Giancana wanted only one thing: loyalty. From that moment, Sammy Davis Jr. became untouchable. When racist groups sent threats, they disappeared. When a reporter tried to expose his interracial romance with actress Kim Novak, the man received a visit and dropped the story overnight. Hollywood whispered that Giancana had made a call. Whether that was true or not, one fact remained. Sammy's name stayed off the blacklist. But the arrangement came with chains. Giancana wasn't protecting him out of kindness. He was using him. The mob needed stars like Sammy and Sinatra to legitimize their casinos, to draw the kind of crowd that turned Vegas from a desert into an empire. So Sammy became part of the act. He smiled bigger, danced harder, pretended the world was fair. Off stage, it was different. He drank too much, barely slept, and kept his pistol nearby when he traveled. He knew the protection worked both ways. It kept him safe, but it also kept him owned. Then in 1961, things changed forever. Sammy married a white actress, Mae Britt. It was love, reckless in public, and in the eyes of America, it was a crime. Networks threatened to cancel his shows. The Kennedy campaign, fearful of backlash, uninvited him from the inauguration gala, an event Sinatra had promised him personally. But Giancana didn't care. As long as Sammy kept performing, Vegas was his to rule. The real trouble began when Giancana's empire started to crumble. The FBI closed in. Federal raids shook the Strip. One by one, the old mob faces vanished, arrested, exiled, or killed. And with them went Sammy's shield. Suddenly, the phone calls stopped coming. Casino owners grew cautious. TV producers whispered about bad associations. He was no longer protected, just exposed. In interviews, Sammy tried to laugh it off. He said he'd been lucky, that he'd never felt safer in his life. But his friends saw the truth. The charm was gone. The exhaustion had settled in. He was still working, still dazzling, but the sparkle in his eyes, the invincible energy, had dimmed. He once told a journalist, "When you're the only one in the room who looks like you never stop performing, even when the show's over." And maybe that was his tragedy. He had spent his life trying to prove he belonged, to Hollywood, to Vegas, to America. But in the end, he was still trapped in a deal he hadn't made, but couldn't escape. In 1967, he was nearly killed in a car crash on a desert highway. He lost his left eye. Some said it was bad luck. Others said it was a warning. Sammy himself joked about it later, because that's what he did. But those who were close to him said he changed after that night. He stopped believing in protection. Years later, when he looked back on the Vegas years, he said quietly, "They gave me the biggest stage in the world, and the smallest space to stand on. He survived the mob, the racism, the scandals, and the silence. But survival isn't the same as freedom. By the time he died in 1990, the golden days of the Rat Pack were long gone. The lights of Vegas burned brighter than ever, but none of them were for him. He sang and danced his way through a minefield. The world loved the show, but never noticed the man who was bleeding behind it. Frank Sinatra, the comeback the mob built. By the early 1950s, Frank Sinatra was finished. His records weren't selling, his film career had collapsed, and his marriage to Ava Gardner was crumbling in the public eye. Once hailed as the voice, Sinatra was now seen as yesterday's news. Washed up, volatile, and unemployable. In a world obsessed with youth and control, there are only two kinds of stars, the protected and the forgotten. Sinatra refused to be the latter. That's when the men from Chicago came calling. Sam Giancana, a ruthless but charismatic boss of the Chicago outfit, admired Sinatra's music. He saw in him not just a singer, but a tool. Vegas was booming, and the mob needed legitimate faces to draw the crowds. Sinatra was perfect. Famous, desperate, and easy to manipulate. It began with favors. A new recording contract here, a sold-out weekend there. Then came introductions to the owners of the Sands, the Flamingo, the Desert Inn. Men with thick wallets and thicker records. Overnight, Sinatra's career roared back to life. He had a seat at every high roller's table and a microphone waiting whenever he wanted it. But those stages didn't belong to him. They belonged to the men who paid for them. Mafia protection in Las Vegas wasn't about keeping people safe. It was about ownership. The outfit financed the casinos, the unions, even the orchestras. If a singer didn't cooperate, the shows vanished. The phone stopped ringing. Or worse, Sinatra learned quickly. He played along, charming, loyal, and silent. He sang for crowds filled with mobsters, politicians, and sometimes both. Behind the stage curtains, deals were made, debts were settled, and secrets were buried. And then, the whispers began. FBI wiretaps caught Giancana's name mentioned alongside Sinatra's more times than anyone could explain. Reporters snapped photos of them together at private clubs, of Sinatra shaking hands with men already under federal indictment. The illusion of freedom was cracking. When John F. Kennedy rose to power, Sinatra believed his redemption had arrived. Kennedy's charisma matched his own, and Frank threw himself into the campaign, singing, performing, and hosting. Behind the scenes, Giancana used Sinatra as a bridge to the White House, offering help that no one wanted to acknowledge. But when the investigations closed in, Kennedy's team turned their backs on Sinatra. Fast. The White House cut off contact. FBI agents raided Sinatra's Vegas suites. Studio executives quietly froze his contracts. It was the perfect irony. The mob had built his comeback, and now the government used it to destroy him. Sinatra tried to distance himself. He burned letters, denied connections, even confronted Giancana in private. But in the world they both lived in, you didn't just walk away. You were released if they decided you were no longer useful. For Sinatra, freedom came not as a gift, but as an exile. The mob stopped calling, the politicians stopped visiting, and his name became a liability. The man who had once stood in every spotlight was now performing to prove his innocence, to show he belonged to no one. In public, he smiled again. On stage, his voice regained its confidence, smooth and unshaken. But those close to him said something had changed. The laughter was forced, the eyes colder. He had survived the Mafia's embrace, but not without scars. Every friend lost, every deal undone, every headline whispering mob ties was a reminder of the invisible chain he could never quite break. Years later, when asked about those days, Sinatra never denied, but never confirmed. He'd simply say, "I did what I had to do to sing." And in that single sentence lay the truth of every star who ever dealt with the darkness. You can escape the mob, but you can never escape the price of their protection. Dean Martin, the mob's favorite gentleman. Dean Martin made fame look effortless. While Sinatra fought his way back with sweat and rage, Martin floated through the chaos like smoke curling from a cigarette. always smiling, always calm. To the audience, he was the embodiment of cool, the man who never cared too much, never tried too hard. But that calm, as it turned out, came with a cost. Behind the charm was a quiet deal, the kind that wasn't written on paper, but carved into silence. When Dean Martin split from Jerry Lewis in 1956, everyone expected him to fade away. Jerry had the energy, the slapstick, the spotlight. Dean had nothing but a drink and a grin. But in the desert of Las Vegas, charm was currency, and Martin was about to meet the man who could turn it into gold, Johnny Roselli. They called him the Hollywood diplomat of the Chicago outfit, a man who wore suits like armor and spoke with the calm of someone who didn't need to raise his voice to be dangerous. Roselli understood how the entertainment world worked. He didn't threaten stars, he made them. He gave Dean everything the studios had taken away: a residency at the Sands Hotel, exclusive slots on the Strip, a cut of the tables when the shows sold out. Overnight, Martin became Vegas royalty, his name glowing above every marquee, his face plastered on every billboard. But the spotlight, as always, came with shadows. When the Mafia helped you, it wasn't a favor. It was an investment. Dean performed not just for the crowds, but for the bosses who sat up front. Their laughter a little too loud, their eyes a little too sharp. They adored him because he made them look good, clean, classy, untouchable. Every night he toasted to them with a glass of scotch, joking his way through songs like "Ain't That a Kick in the Head?" The audience heard comedy, the mob heard obedience. He never talked business, but business always surrounded him. Roselli handled his contracts, arranged his tours, even smoothed over tax discrepancies. And when FBI agents began sniffing around, Roselli told Dean not to worry. The government didn't touch entertainers. But that wasn't true. The FBI had files on every member of the Rat Pack: Sinatra, Davis, Martin, tracking their movements through the same casinos and clubs owned by the outfit. Dean's name appeared repeatedly, always next to Roselli's, always marked under observation. He laughed it off. That was his defense mechanism. Laughter. It kept fear at bay, and fear was the one thing the mob could smell like blood. Then in 1976, everything changed. Roselli's body was found stuffed into a 55-gallon oil drum floating off the coast of Miami. His death wasn't subtle. It was a message, a warning to everyone who thought they could leave the game. Dean didn't talk about it publicly. He didn't attend the funeral. He simply went quiet. Friends said he withdrew from the social scene, stopped calling old contacts, and started drinking more. The effortless cool turned hollow. He kept working, of course. The show had to go on. It always did. But something in him had broken. Without Roselli's protection, Dean was no longer the mob's favorite gentleman, just another aging star trying to stay relevant. His phone stopped ringing as often. The casinos moved on to younger acts. He wasn't blacklisted, but he was quietly replaced. For the rest of his life, Dean never confirmed his relationship with Roselli or the outfit. When reporters asked, he'd smile that same lazy grin and say, "You know me, I don't talk business." It was the perfect answer, the kind that meant everything and nothing at the same time. But those who knew him best said that behind closed doors he carried guilt, not for what he'd done, but for what he'd survived. He had seen what happened to people who crossed the line, and he'd played the part of the obedient entertainer so well that even the mob began to believe he didn't care. That was his armor, his disguise, his survival. In the end, Dean Martin lived like he performed, smooth, detached, and unbothered. But when the curtain finally fell, all that remained was the echo of a man who had laughed his way through fear. He had been protected. He had been adored. And when the protection was gone, so was the magic. In Las Vegas, the narrator says softly, he played the gentleman everyone wanted him to be, until the gentleman who made him disappeared. Tony Bennett, the gentleman in the cage. Tony Bennett was the embodiment of class, the voice that made America fall in love with love. He wasn't dangerous. He wasn't political. He wasn't wild. He was safe, or at least that's what people thought. Behind that elegance, behind the tuxedo and the velvet baritone, there was a quiet truth. Even the gentlest man in show business needed protection. And in the 1950s, protection always had a name and a price. Bennett came up at a time when Las Vegas was run like a kingdom, and every kingdom had its lords. Frank Costello, the prime minister of the underworld, ruled New York's gambling empire, but his reach stretched all the way to the desert. He didn't care about jazz or swing, but he understood one thing: music made money clean. Costello saw in Bennett a perfect investment, an image of purity the Mafia could use to legitimize their hotels and clubs. A man who'd never question where the checks came from. So when Tony's early singles began climbing the charts, doors opened faster than talent alone could explain. Residencies at the Flamingo, radio play on every major East Coast station, invitations to perform for private gatherings of casino owners who never smiled but always paid in cash. It all looked like luck. It was anything but. Bennett's manager quietly hinted that the right people believed in him. When he asked what that meant, he was told to stop asking. And so Tony did what good men often do in dangerous times. He looked away. While other singers stumbled under scandals and debts, Bennett thrived. He was the gentleman crooner, adored by critics and the mob alike. Vegas called him the safest bet in town. But the deeper his success grew, the tighter the cage became. He couldn't refuse a show, not when the invitations came from men like Costello or Meyer-Lansky. He couldn't pick his set list. Certain songs were requested. He couldn't even control his public image. The mob-backed radio stations made sure his ballads played on repeat, while any mention of him as an independent artist mysteriously disappeared from press columns. He was loved, yes, but he wasn't free. Tony began to notice the pattern. Other performers who tried to cut ties, singers who questioned where the money came from, suddenly lost bookings, airtime, or worse. Some were audited by the IRS the next month. Others just vanished from the circuit. By the early 1960s, the illusion of safety began to crack. The FBI's investigations into organized crime reached the entertainment world. Agents started showing up at Vegas hotels, asking questions. Reporters whispered about mob-controlled crooners. Tony hated it. He'd spent his whole life building a reputation of integrity, and now the same machine that had lifted him up was threatening to bury him in scandal. One night, after a show at the Sands, he told a friend backstage, "It's a beautiful cage, isn't it? Gold bar, but still a cage." It was the first time he admitted, even privately, that he was trapped. So he made a decision. He left Vegas. He walked away from the residencies, the guaranteed money, the connections. He focused on concert tours, on albums recorded his way. Smaller, riskier, but honest. The punishment came swiftly. Radio stations that once played him daily stopped taking his calls. His airtime dried up. One major network lost an entire televised special. He wasn't blacklisted officially, just quietly erased from the Mafia's playlist. But Bennett didn't bend. He recorded albums of jazz standards that critics adored, even when sales lagged. He surrounded himself with real musicians, not fixers. And slowly, painfully, he rebuilt. This time without anyone pulling the strings. Years later, when he looked back on the Vegas years, he didn't speak in anger. He spoke with that same calm dignity that had defined him. He said, "Those were the times. Everyone was owned by someone. The trick was remembering who you were when the lights went out." Tony Bennett lived long enough to see Vegas transform from a gangster's paradise into a corporate theme park. But even in his old age, when asked if he'd ever go back, he just smiled faintly and said, "No, I left my cage there." He was the gentleman the mob couldn't corrupt, the narrator concludes softly, because while they could buy his stage, they could never buy his soul. Jerry Lewis and the Rat Pack. Laughter for the bosses. In the golden glow of Las Vegas, laughter was currency, and no one printed it better than Jerry Lewis. The man was chaos incarnate, elastic, loud, unpredictable. He could make an entire room forget its worries with a single fall, a single face, a single perfectly timed scream. To the world, he was comedy itself. But to the men who really ran the strip, Jerry Lewis was something else entirely. A guarantee. The Rat Pack, Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, and Lewis weren't just performers. They were the show that kept the Mafia's empire alive. Their appearances at the Sands and Flamingo didn't just draw crowds, they validated the business. The presence of these men, beloved by America, made the underworld look glamorous, charming, even patriotic. And that illusion was everything. Behind the curtains, Vegas wasn't just built on music and laughter. It was built on control, the kind that came with ledgers, threats, and envelopes full of cash. The outfit, the Chicago mob, and the East Coast families had divided the city among themselves. Each casino had an owner in the light and another in the dark. And for every night of glamour on stage, there was a quiet deal in the back room to make sure the stars stayed cooperative. Jerry Lewis didn't need convincing, at least not at first. He loved the spotlight. He loved Vegas, and the mob loved him back. Johnny Rosselli, the smooth-talking diplomat who handled Hollywood's dirty deals, took a liking to him. He arranged residencies, comedy specials, and private gigs that paid triple the usual rate. In return, Lewis performed for select audiences, mob bosses, casino investors, and their families, always under the polite fiction of private charity events. Those events weren't optional. To refuse an invitation was to insult men who weren't used to hearing the word no. To cancel a show meant losing more than money. It meant losing safety. Jerry, ever the showman, played along. He joked through it, made the gangsters laugh until their eyes watered, until they slapped the tables and demanded another drink. He gave them what they wanted: entertainment, distraction, and deniability. And in return, they gave him everything he thought he wanted: endless money, endless applause, and the illusion that he was untouchable. But illusions, like laughter, don't last forever. By the mid-1960s, the government's attention turned to Vegas. The FBI's Operation Stardust began tracking mafia involvement in casino profits. Every entertainer who'd ever played there, including the Rat Pack, became a name in a file. Jerry's connection to Rosselli suddenly wasn't a secret. He'd built his fame on comedy, but now his name appeared in a scandal. Reporters began hinting that his charity telethons, legitimate fundraisers for muscular dystrophy, were being skimmed by organized associates. No evidence ever surfaced, but in the world of show business, rumors can ruin faster than truth can repair. The mob didn't come to his defense. They never did when someone became inconvenient. When Johnny Rosselli was found murdered in 1976, cut, stuffed into an oil drum, and dumped into Biscayne Bay, Jerry didn't say a word publicly, but those who knew him said it broke something inside him. He stopped performing in Vegas for a while. His humor changed. Darker, sharper, more desperate. On stage, he still played the fool, but the timing was different. The laughter came faster, louder like a shield. The irony was cruel. The mob that once protected him had made him invincible. But once they were gone, the protection vanished. And so did the magic. By the late 1970s, Jerry Lewis was no longer Vegas's golden child. New comics came, slicker, cleaner, untouched by the old stains of the Strip. He tried to modernize: television specials, guest appearances, film comebacks. But something in him always seemed haunted. In private interviews decades later, Lewis admitted the truth without naming names. Vegas used to be run by people who cared about the show. Now it's run by people who care about numbers. But back then, if you didn't make the right people laugh, you didn't come back. He wasn't exaggerating. Laughter had kept him alive, literally. And so the man who wants to find joy became the living proof that even happiness can be a weapon in the right hands. He danced for devils in dinner jackets, the narrator says softly, and when the devils disappeared, he found that the laughter went with them. The Rat Pack would scatter, Sinatra chasing politics, Martin retreating into silence, Davis into exhaustion. Jerry was the last clown standing, and he carried the ghost of that era until the end of his life. Because in Las Vegas, comedy wasn't innocent. It was the sound of survival. And the silence that followed was the sound of freedom. Louis Prima and Keely Smith, the lovers of the flamingo. Before Elvis, before rock and roll, Las Vegas had Louis Prima, a trumpet, a wild grin, and a sound that could make even the most jaded high roller tap his glass to the rhythm. When he sang, the room moved, half Italian swing, half hurricane. And when Keely Smith joined him, everything changed. Together they were electricity, a love story, a band, a brand. But like every great act in Vegas, someone else owned the stage beneath their feet. The Flamingo Hotel was no ordinary venue. It was the dream and the downfall of Bugsy Siegel, the mobster who turned the desert into a kingdom of lights. After Siegel's execution in 1947, his partners, Meyer Lansky and the other East Coast bosses, took over the empire. By the time Lewis and Keely began headlining there in the 1950s, the casino was still soaked in the same blood that built it. Louis didn't mind. He wasn't naive. He knew who signed the checks. But to him, the mob was just another part of show business. They paid on time, he joked once, and they never asked for encores. The truth was darker. The Mafia didn't just pay him, they owned him. Prima's shows were loud, wild, and profitable, exactly what the Flamingo needed to stay full. Every night, mob bosses sat in the front row, cigars glowing under the dim lights, watching their investment perform. When the band got tired, the men in suits would lean over to the pit boss and murmur, "Another set," and Lewis would play. He didn't complain, not openly. After all, being the king of the strip was better than being forgotten. But behind the laughter, the exhaustion crept in. He was working 6 nights a week, sometimes 3 shows a night, with the same energy that had once made him famous. And Keely, his wife, his voice, his anchor, began to crack under the pressure. She loved the music but hated the world that came with it. The endless nights, the gambling, the shadowy men who treated their art like an investment. Still, she kept singing, because to stop would mean more than losing a paycheck. It would mean defying the people who made the rules. Vegas loved to claim it gave artists freedom, but for Louis and Keely, it was a velvet cage, gilded and guarded. When the mob wanted them to smile, they smiled. When the mob wanted romance, they kissed on stage, even when their marriage was falling apart backstage. The illusion of love sold tickets. The truth didn't matter. By the early 1960s, the act began to crumble. Keely filed for divorce. Louis tried to go solo, but the magic, the balance, was gone. The bookings got smaller, the checks got lighter. The same casino bosses who once begged for encores now pretended not to know him. When corporate money replaced mob money in Vegas, the old performers became disposable. The new management wanted younger faces, newer sounds. Louis Prima, once the heartbeat of the strip, was quietly pushed aside. One night, an old stagehand found him sitting alone in the empty Flamingo ballroom, staring at the stage that used to belong to him. He wasn't angry, just tired. He looked up and said softly, "Vegas made me. Vegas unmade me." It wasn't bitterness, it was truth. He'd been the soundtrack of a kingdom built by criminals, and when the kingdom changed hands, the music no longer mattered. Louis Prima would fade into obscurity, performing smaller shows across the country, his name now a nostalgic echo of a wilder, freer time that never truly existed. Keely went her own way, singing softer songs, the kind you sing after you've survived something dangerous. Years later, when she was asked about those nights at the Flamingo, she didn't name names. She just smiled and said, "We sang for the men who ran the world, and when they were done with us, they changed the station." In the end, the narrator whispers, their love was real, their fame was real, but their freedom was never theirs. Because in Vegas, even love had an owner. And as the lights of the Flamingo fade to black, only the echo of a trumpet remains, distant, defiant, and fading. Thelma Todd, the star who said no. Thelma Todd was everything the 1930s adored. Beautiful, ambitious, and effortlessly funny. She wasn't the tragic type. She was the woman who lit up a room, the kind of star who made people believe that Hollywood dreams could be real. But her story would prove that charm alone couldn't protect anyone from the men who ran the city in the shadows. By 1934, Todd had built a rare kind of success. She wasn't just a movie star, she was a businesswoman. She opened Thelma Todd's Sidewalk Cafe on the Pacific Coast Highway, a glamorous restaurant where actors, producers, and mobsters sat at the same tables, pretending not to notice each other. The cafe became one of Hollywood's most exclusive spots, and Thelma ran it herself with confidence and grace. But that success drew the wrong kind of attention. Among her regular guests was Lucky Luciano, one of the most powerful mob bosses in America. Luciano had recently expanded his empire from New York to California, investing in nightclubs, casinos, and real estate. Anything that could move money quietly and attract celebrities. He saw Thelma's Cafe as an opportunity, the perfect location to install a secret gambling room upstairs where high-profile guests could play, drink, and settle debts. Thelma refused. She told him her cafe was for Hollywood's elite, not for mob business. Luciano smiled politely, but everyone in Hollywood knew that refusing him was never a good idea. Soon after, strange things started happening. There were threats disguised as business suggestions, deliveries went missing, her staff reported being followed, and her business partners began pressuring her to compromise. Thelma stayed defiant, publicly cheerful, privately anxious. She confided to friends that she was being forced into deals she didn't want. She wanted to leave Los Angeles, maybe go to New York, make films on her own terms. But Hollywood didn't let go easily, and neither did the men behind it. On the morning of December 16, 1935, Thelma Todd was found dead in her car, parked inside the garage of her business partner's home. The official cause was carbon monoxide poisoning. Police ruled it an accident. Some called it suicide, but many details didn't fit. She was wearing expensive evening clothes and jewelry, her car had almost no gas left, and the walk to the garage was steep and cold. Her friends insisted she wouldn't have gone there willingly. She had too much planned. New films, a holiday party, even a trip she'd been excited for. But the case was closed quickly, and her death became one of Hollywood's most famous mysteries. Behind the scenes, the investigation was quietly steered away from certain names. The cafe changed hands soon after, and several of her associates disappeared from the scene. Lucky Luciano left California within months, focusing on his East Coast operations. The studios avoided mentioning her death in press releases, preferring to remember her as the smiling comedienne. Hollywood moved on, but Thelma's story didn't fade. Writers, biographers, and investigators would revisit it for decades, uncovering small pieces of the world she'd been trapped in. A world where business, politics, and organized crime shared the same dinner tables. Whether or not Luciano had a direct role in her death remains unknown. But what's clear is this: Thelma Todd lived in a city where saying no to the wrong people could end a career, or worse, erase a life. Her independence made her dangerous. Her refusal made her unforgettable. She was one of the few women in Hollywood who tried to build something of her own, separate from the men who ran everything else. In the end, her cafe became her symbol, a place that promised freedom but sat under the same shadow as the studios and casinos. Thelma Todd was never truly protected. She was watched, admired, and controlled until she stopped playing the game. And when the laughter stopped, Hollywood called it tragedy. But for those who knew her, it was a warning. In a city owned by men like Lucky Luciano, no woman's no ever went unanswered. Ava Gardner, the woman who lost her protection. Ava Gardner was born to be seen. She had the kind of beauty that made people stop mid-sentence. Raw, magnetic, almost dangerous. In the 1950s, she wasn't just a movie star. She was a global symbol of glamour. But that same beauty drew her into the orbit of men who wanted to own it. Producers, studio heads, and powerful figures far beyond Hollywood's walls. When Ava met Frank Sinatra, it was more than a romance. It was an explosion. Their love was legendary, passionate, public, and self-destructive. Sinatra had connections everywhere, in the studios in Washington and in the smoky back rooms of Las Vegas casinos. Those casinos were financed by men whose names appeared in FBI files. Sam Giancana, Lucky Luciano, and other figures who quietly built an empire from gambling, liquor, and entertainment. Through Sinatra, Ava became part of that circle. She was welcomed into private clubs and flown to secret shows. She never had to worry about reporters or intruders. The mob respected Sinatra. He brought in money, audiences, and legitimacy. That respect extended to her. She could travel safely, dine anywhere, stay in penthouse suites guarded by men in dark suits. Everyone called it protection, but protection in that world was just another word for belonging to someone. Ava was no fool. She saw how the system worked, how favors were traded, how debts were collected. When she and Sinatra argued, phones would ring and problems would disappear. If she needed something, a canceled headline, a studio apology, a sudden opportunity, it arrived like magic. She understood what that meant, and it frightened her. Sinatra loved her, but his world was a world of loyalty and control. His friendships with men like Giancana were complex, half business, half brotherhood. And when Ava tried to pull away from the chaos, the men around them noticed. To them, Sinatra's woman was part of his power, part of the legend they were all investing in. Losing her wasn't just personal, it was symbolic. Their marriage collapsed under the pressure. The fights grew public, the tabloids ruthless. By 1957, Ava left the United States to live in Spain, desperate for peace. But distance didn't erase the past. Stories followed her about the phone calls, the money trails, the names that connected her glamorous life to the underworld that funded Hollywood's golden age. She stayed silent, not out of fear, but because she understood the cost of speaking too much. The same system that once protected her could easily erase her career. So she chose exile over exposure. While her contemporaries chased roles in publicity, Ava retreated into quiet films and long walks through Madrid. In interviews, she spoke about loneliness more than fame. She said she felt freer abroad than she ever had in Hollywood. And that was the truest thing she ever said. As the decades passed, Sinatra's influence waned, and with it went the last traces of that hidden network. By the 1970s, the mob's grip on show business had weakened, replaced by corporations and contracts. But Ava never returned. She had seen too much, lived too close to the men who blurred the line between affection and authority. In her memoir, years later, she didn't name names. She simply wrote, "The world I lived in wasn't built for women who wanted control." Those words said everything. Ava Gardner's beauty gave her power. The Mafia's shadow gave her safety. But when she walked away, both vanished. Her story wasn't a tragedy of love or fame. It was a quiet liberation. She escaped the protection that had once surrounded her, but she paid for it with solitude. Ava Gardner learned what every woman in Hollywood eventually learned. Being adored by powerful men isn't the same as being free. And when the spotlight faded, she discovered that real peace only came when no one was left to protect her. Marilyn Monroe, the woman everyone wanted to protect. By the mid-1950s, Marilyn Monroe was the most recognizable woman in the world. Every photograph, every headline, every smile seemed effortless, but nothing about her life ever was. In Hollywood, protection was a word whispered behind closed doors, and for Marilyn, it became a constant presence. When she rose to fame under 20th Century Fox, the studio controlled every part of her image. From the color of her lipstick to the way she laughed in interviews. The studio's executives had deep ties to Las Vegas and its investors. The same men whose names appeared on casino deeds and in FBI reports about organized crime. They financed films, arranged nightclub tours, and kept the money flowing between Hollywood and the desert. To them, a star like Marilyn wasn't just talent. She was an asset. Through her connections in the entertainment world, Marilyn entered the orbit of powerful men who were closely watched by the FBI. Some had political influence. Others ran the casinos that the mob quietly controlled. They adored her charm, her innocence, and her willingness to entertain. Invitations arrived daily, private dinners, hotel openings, charity galas. At every event, there was always someone nearby who looked out for her. These protectors handled more than her security. They negotiated appearances, silenced rumors, and made sure her image remained perfect. If a scandal threatened to surface, a leaked photo, an unplanned pregnancy, a bad contract, it disappeared overnight. Money changed hands. Stories vanished. And Marilyn kept smiling for the cameras. But the protection that once felt like safety began to feel like confinement. When she formed her own production company in 1955, it was an act of rebellion. She wanted control over her films, her choices, her life. For the first time, she was saying no to the system that had built her. The move made headlines, but behind the scenes it made enemies. Studio executives resented her independence. Their business partners in Las Vegas didn't like losing a star who drew audiences and money to their venues. Offers started drying up, projects were delayed without explanation, and the people who once promised to protect her quietly stepped away. Marilyn began to understand how power really worked. The same men who had elevated her could make her disappear from the spotlight just as easily. The favors they'd granted had strings attached, and now those strings pulled tight. She tried to distance herself from everyone who claimed ownership. The studios, the fixers, the friends who monitored her every move. But freedom came with isolation. Her health declined under the pressure. Prescription pills replaced sleep. Late-night calls went unanswered. The woman who had once been surrounded by people now spent her evenings alone, writing notes about how she wanted to start over. In those notes, she described the same longing again and again, not for fame, but for peace. By 1962, Marilyn was tired of being protected. She fired several members of her inner circle, including longtime handlers linked to her studio contracts. She had begun to talk openly about her experiences, not naming names, but hinting that she knew things she was never supposed to know. To her, it was simply honesty. To others, it was dangerous. That summer, she was gone. Official reports called it an overdose. The world called it tragedy. Her funeral was attended by the same people who had once managed her career. Producers, agents, and men in dark suits who never appeared on any studio payroll. Over time, countless theories filled the silence. Some pointed to politics, others to the pressures of fame. But the truth may have been simpler. Marilyn Monroe lived in a world controlled by power, money, and fear, and she finally tried to live without them. Her life was a lesson that, in Hollywood, protection was never free. Every favor cost a piece of her freedom, and when she stopped paying, the protection disappeared. She was the woman everyone wanted to protect, until she wanted to protect herself. Jean Harlow, the angel who knew too much. Long before Marilyn Monroe, there was Jean Harlow, the original blonde bombshell, the woman who taught Hollywood how to sell seduction. She was radiant, witty, and endlessly photogenic. But behind her playful smile was a studio system powered by men who weren't all from Hollywood. Some came from Chicago and New York, men who made fortunes not from film reels, but from gambling and racketeering. When Jane was discovered in the early 1930s, MGM was already tied to Las Vegas and its silent investors. The mob's money flowed through casinos, distribution companies, and theater chains that funded the golden age of movies. They didn't need to own the studios outright. They just needed a cut of the profits and a few stars to keep their investments shining. Jean Harlow became one of those stars. Her manager had connections in the nightclub circuit, a world already dominated by organized crime. Her husband, producer Paul Byrne, worked closely with executives who were rumored to have friends in the underworld. To outsiders, her life looked glamorous. To insiders, it was full of quiet deals and controlled narratives. When Paul Byrne was found dead in 1932, the scandal could have ended her career overnight. The story was explosive. A Hollywood producer dead in his home. Whispers of money, jealousy, and threats. But within hours, MGM's top executives stepped in. They ordered silence, called in police contacts, and made sure Jean's name stayed out of the headlines. Reporters were warned, evidence was sealed, and the studio's fixers handled the rest. Officially, Byrne's death was ruled a suicide. Unofficially, everyone knew too much and said nothing. For Jean, it was a nightmare disguised as mercy. The studio's protection saved her career, but it also locked her in. She was now too valuable, too exposed, and too knowledgeable about the men who financed her world. After that, Jean's life wasn't her own. Her filming schedule doubled, her interviews were monitored, and her contracts were rewritten to bind her even tighter to MGM. When she tried to take time off, she was reminded of how much the studio and its silent partners had done for her. They called it gratitude. It felt like ownership. Her co-workers began noticing her exhaustion. She would arrive on set pale and quiet, her once glamorous smile slipping away between takes. Friends later recalled how she confided that she didn't feel free, that the people who promised to protect her never really let her go. The deeper she sank into fame, the more isolated she became. She knew too much about her late husband's mysterious business ties, about the private meetings between producers and casino owners, about the deals that kept MGM's finances flowing even through the Great Depression. But speaking out would have meant ending her career, and perhaps more. By 1937, her health began to fail. She fainted on set, struggled to breathe, and was forced to stop filming Saratoga. Executives downplayed her condition. The studio's doctors insisted she was fine. But within days, she was gone. At just 26 years old, her funeral was arranged swiftly, with MGM covering every detail. The studio released a statement celebrating her life and released her unfinished film as a tribute. It became a massive hit. Even in death, Jean was profitable. Afterward, those who had once called themselves her protectors disappeared from public view. No one investigated further. No one questioned why the studio had worked so hard to control the story. Jean Harlow became a symbol, the first woman whose beauty was used to sell Hollywood's dream, and the first to be consumed by the power behind it. She had been promised safety, loyalty, and fame. Instead, she became another name on a long list of stars who lived and died under the illusion of protection. Hollywood called her the Platinum Angel, but angels, no matter how bright, don't last long in a city run by men who prefer the dark. Lana Turner, the star who loved the wrong man. Lana Turner had everything Hollywood could offer: beauty, fame, and the kind of stardom that made her untouchable. To the public, she was the perfect image of glamour: diamonds, silk gowns, and red carpets. But behind the glitter was a truth no studio would ever admit. Her life had been taken over by the same world of power and fear that controlled so much of Hollywood's underbelly. By the late 1940s, organized crime wasn't just operating in Las Vegas. It was already in Los Angeles, running clubs, loaning money to producers, and controlling the night spots where actors signed their biggest deals. And in that world moved Mickey Cohen, the charismatic and ruthless Los Angeles mob boss who replaced Bugsy Siegel after his death. Cohen had movie stars, directors, and studio owners in his pocket, and one of the women closest to that circle was Lana Turner. Lana's fame made her a constant target for the men who wanted to control her. She had already survived several scandals and failed marriages when she met Johnny Stompanato, a former soldier turned bodyguard for Mickey Cohen. To the outside world, Johnny was handsome, charming, and devoted. Inside Lana's life, he became something else entirely. A man who watched her every move, who decided where she could go and who she could speak to. He wasn't her manager, but he acted like one. He called the studios, interfered with film contracts, and demanded that producers go through him for scheduling. Everyone knew who really sent him: Mickey Cohen. Cohen liked having his men close to the stars. It made him seem powerful, even civilized. At first, Lana believed she was in love. Johnny promised to protect her from the press, from gossip, from everyone who wanted a piece of her. But soon that protection became control. Friends recalled that he would show up on set uninvited, pick fights with producers, and even follow her to meetings. Lana was trapped, adored in public, terrified in private. Cohen's reach in Hollywood meant that even if she wanted help, no one would cross him. Her only escape came one night in April 1958, when an argument in her Beverly Hills home turned violent. Her teenage daughter, Cheryl, stepped into the room, and in a moment that would shock the world, Johnny Stompanato was killed. The newspapers exploded. The tabloids printed every rumor imaginable: that Lana had plotted it, that Mickey Cohen would retaliate, that the mob would come for revenge. But none of that happened. Within days, Cohen announced publicly that he forgave her and called Stompanato's death a tragic accident. It was an extraordinary gesture, and it wasn't compassion, it was control. Behind that statement was a message. Cohen didn't want the police digging too deep into his affairs. Protecting Lana meant protecting himself. So the story was wrapped up quickly, the inquest closed, and Hollywood moved on. But Lana never truly recovered. Though she kept working and starred in some of her most successful films afterward, she was never again the same. The studios distanced themselves. The men who once sent her flowers stopped calling. She had become a symbol, Not of glamour, but of how close Hollywood always was to the underworld that financed it. Years later in interviews, Lana avoided naming names. She would say only that she fell in love with the wrong man. But those who knew her story understood what that meant, that she had been another casualty of a system that used fear as its currency and love as its weapon. Johnny Stampanato's death marked the end of an era. Afterward, the mob began to retreat from Hollywood, focusing more on Las Vegas and other ventures. But the scars it left behind remained, in careers destroyed, in lives rewritten, in stories like Lana Turner's, where protection turned into imprisonment. Lana spent the rest of her life trying to rebuild her image. She succeeded in some ways. Her performances matured, her reputation softened, but the shadow never left her completely. Every headline, every interview carried the same ghost, the man who said he loved her and the men who sent him. Lana Turner had been promised protection, fame, and devotion. Instead, she became the proof that, in Hollywood, even love could belong to the mob. George Raft, the actor who danced with the mob. Before he ever stepped in front of a camera, George Raft was already famous, not as an actor, but as a dancer. He grew up in Hell's Kitchen, New York, in the same neighborhood that raised gangsters instead of movie stars. He knew the street codes, the faces, the rules of survival. So when he found his way to Hollywood, he brought something no one else in town had: authenticity. In the early 1930s, Raft's career exploded. He played gangsters with a charm that felt too real. Audiences believed every glare, every flick of his hand, every moment of quiet menace. What they didn't know was that George Raft wasn't acting. He was remembering. His childhood friends were now powerful men. Oni Madden, Bugsy Siegel, Lucky Luciano. Names that were whispered in clubs and shouted in police reports. They watched Raft's rise from afar, amused that one of their own had made it in Hollywood. When he visited New York, he was treated like royalty. He wasn't a made man, but he was protected, a symbol of what the underworld could achieve when it wore a tuxedo instead of a gun. Hollywood noticed. So did the FBI. Raft's phone calls were monitored, his friendships cataloged. But he didn't care. He used his connections to survive in an industry as cutthroat as any street corner. When studio heads needed introductions to nightclub owners or private investors, Raft arranged them. When productions shot in Las Vegas, he helped smooth things over, ensuring no one made the wrong kind of enemy. It made him valuable. It also made him dangerous. He turned down roles that glorified informants, claiming he wouldn't betray the people who inspired him. He refused to appear in The Godfather decades later, saying, "I've lived that life once. I don't need to play it." But loyalty had a price. As the 1940s ended, the FBI tightened its investigation into Hollywood's mob ties. Casinos were being raided, and familiar faces were vanishing. George Raft's name appeared again and again in reports, tied to figures like Siegel and Johnny Roselli. Then came the fall. In 1946, Siegel was killed in his Beverly Hills home, a message from the same organization that once protected him. For Raft, it was more than a friend's death. It was the end of the illusion that he could live between both worlds. The studios began distancing themselves. Contracts dissolved. His reputation as too connected cost him roles that could have saved his career. He was never convicted of a crime, never even charged. But in Hollywood, guilt by association was enough. By the 1950s, he was performing in Vegas, not as a star, but as a host, greeting gamblers, shaking hands, smiling through nostalgia. The same mob that once lifted him up now used his name as decoration for their casinos. He had become part of the furniture, a reminder of when Hollywood and the underworld were inseparable. In his later years, he spoke of loyalty with sadness rather than pride. He had protected people who never protected him, and yet, even in regret, he refused to expose anyone. He went to his grave insisting he'd never been a gangster, only a friend. But everyone who knew him understood. George Raft didn't just play gangsters. He was the bridge between the world that built them and the world that worshipped them. He had danced with the mob, and for a while he led. But when the music stopped, the only thing left was silence. Robert Mitchum, the star who survived the system. Robert Mitchum never wanted to be a hero. He wasn't built for the Hollywood machine. Too blunt, too calm, too honest for a town that lived on illusions. But somehow, that's exactly why he became a legend. By the 1940s, Mitchum was one of the most bankable leading men in America. He played loners, drifters, men who carried danger in their eyes. What audiences didn't know was how close those characters were to the real man behind them. Because unlike most of his peers, Mitchum wasn't afraid of the people who truly ran Hollywood's shadows. He grew up around them. Before acting, Mitchum worked odd jobs across the country. Prize fighter, laborer, nightclub bouncer. He knew the language of men who lived outside the law, and he spoke it fluently. That gave him an edge on screen. But off-screen, it gave him credibility with the underworld figures who floated through Los Angeles. He frequented the same nightclubs that Mickey Cohen's men controlled, drank with gamblers, and joked with the same fixers who handled stars' reputations. But Mitchum wasn't one of them. He understood their world, but he never belonged to it. He didn't need protection, and that made him dangerous in a different way. In 1948, his image of rebellion nearly ended his career. He was arrested at a private house party for marijuana possession, a scandal that could have destroyed anyone else. Within hours, the story hit every front page. Movie idol caught in drug raid. For a brief moment, the studio panicked. But then something strange happened. Instead of hiding, Mitchum leaned into it. He smiled for the cameras during his mugshot, shrugged during interviews, and said, "It's just a case of bad publicity." The public loved it. The bad boy image became his brand. Hollywood, always eager to sell a story, realized they couldn't cancel him. He was too authentic. Behind the scenes, the same network that had protected countless stars, mob fixers, studio lawyers, and advisors, quietly made sure his sentence was short and his comeback fast. Some say Mickey Cohen himself intervened, ensuring the arrest didn't escalate into something bigger. No one ever proved it, but it wouldn't have been unusual. In those years, even justice in Los Angeles had a price tag. After his release, Mitchum's stardom only grew. He became the anti-hero of post-war America, the man who didn't care what anyone thought. He worked with Sinatra, befriended outcasts, and refused to bow to the studio system. He was too unpredictable to control, and that made him untouchable. He once told a reporter, "I don't have to act. I just show up and they pay me." But that was only half the truth. He acted every day, just not on screen. He acted like he didn't care, because caring in Hollywood was how people got crushed through the 1950s and 60s. As other stars faded under scandal, Mitchum endured. He didn't need protection from the mob or the studios, because he had built something they couldn't buy: credibility. He could walk into Mickey Cohen's club or a studio executive's mansion and be treated exactly the same, with respect and a little fear. He watched others fall, stars who owed too many favors, producers who lost everything when their backers changed sides. He survived because he never owed anyone anything. And in a world built on debt and secrets, that was the rarest power of all. By the time he grew older, Mitchum had become a symbol of authenticity, a relic of a Hollywood that no longer existed. When asked how he'd survived so long in an industry built on manipulation, he smiled and said, "I kept my mouth shut, my head down, and my conscience clean." It wasn't the mob that saved Robert Mitchum. It was his refusal to play their game. And maybe that's why he outlived them all. The last man standing in a city that never forgave anyone for knowing too much. Bugsy Siegel, the gangster who tried to become Hollywood. Bugsy Siegel didn't want to be remembered as a killer. He wanted to be remembered as a visionary. To him, the mob wasn't just business, it was show business. And nowhere captured that fantasy better than Hollywood. By the late 1930s, Siegel was one of the most recognizable names in organized crime. He had money, charm, and connections that reached from New York to Los Angeles. But unlike his partners, he didn't want to rule from the shadows. He wanted to be seen. Hollywood gave him that chance. He dressed like a star, drove the same cars as actors, and threw parties that made studio moguls jealous. At his mansion in Beverly Hills, movie stars, politicians, and mob figures drank from the same glasses. A collision of two empires built on illusion. Everyone loved Siegel because he didn't act like a gangster. He acted like a celebrity. He invested in films, dated actresses, and funded nightclubs that doubled as meeting places for producers and mob investors. When police raided those clubs, the names in the guest books were quietly erased. For the studios, Siegel's money solved problems. For Siegel, Hollywood gave him something he'd never had before: legitimacy. But there was a limit to how much legitimacy a gangster could buy. Siegel's biggest dream and downfall was Las Vegas. He envisioned a paradise in the desert, casinos run like palaces, entertainers headlining grand stages, money flowing through every table and theater. He called it the Flamingo. Hollywood laughed at first. A luxury casino in the middle of nowhere sounded like madness. But Siegel didn't care. He convinced investors, many of them his mob partners, to finance the project. He also courted Hollywood's elite, promising them front row seats in a city that would soon belong to them. But the project bled money. Construction costs doubled, then tripled. Millions vanished through bad deals, theft, and mismanagement. Rumors spread that Siegel was skimming funds. Rumors that didn't sit well with the men who had financed him. He tried to save the Flamingo by making it glamorous. He flew in performers from Los Angeles, hired dancers, musicians, and designers to create a spectacle worthy of the movies. When it finally opened in 1946, the press called it Hollywood in the Desert, but the crowds didn't come. The first week was a disaster, and the men who had invested weren't known for forgiving failure. In June 1947, as Siegel sat in his Beverly Hills home reading the newspaper, a bullet shattered the window and ended his life instantly. The murder was never solved. Officially, no one was charged. Unofficially, everyone knew it was a message. The next morning, his partners took control of the Flamingo. Within months, it became the crown jewel of Las Vegas, the city Siegel had dreamed of. Hollywood stars flocked there, performing for crowds of mob-backed high rollers. What he built out of vision, others would turn into profit. For a while, his name was taboo. The studios distanced themselves and the press sanitized the story. But over time, Hollywood changed its mind. They turned him into legend, the charming outlaw, the gangster with class. Movies romanticized him, songs mentioned him, and the Flamingo still bore his ghost. What they never mentioned was the truth. Bugsy Siegel didn't just bring the mob to Las Vegas. He brought Hollywood there too. He proved that organized crime and organized entertainment were built on the same foundation: illusion, loyalty, and money that always flowed in the dark. He wanted to be a movie star. He ended up becoming something far more dangerous: the man who showed Hollywood what the mob could look like in a tuxedo. And though he died young, his dream didn't. Every casino, every showroom, every spotlight on the Vegas Strip still carries his reflection: the man who turned crime into a brand. Johnny Rosselli, so the fixer who knew everyone. Johnny Rosselli was the man who smiled in every room, the kind of presence that could calm a room full of egos. He wasn't loud like Bugsy Siegel or flamboyant like Mickey Cohen. He was quiet, polished, and impossibly well-connected. In a city built on secrets, Johnny Rosselli knew them all. Born Filippo Sacco in Italy and raised in Chicago, Rosselli worked his way through the criminal ranks during Prohibition. But unlike most gangsters, he didn't stay in the shadows. He dressed better than actors, spoke softly, and understood something most mobsters never did. Power didn't always come from fear. It came from access. In the 1930s, he was sent to Los Angeles by Chicago outfit boss Al Capone's successors, tasked with representing their interests in the film industry. Hollywood was full of money and very few rules. The perfect place for someone like Rosselli. He didn't threaten people. He made things happen. He found lost investments, settled debts, and negotiated contracts that no one else could. If a studio needed funding for a risky film, Rosselli knew who could provide it. If a troublesome gossip columnist needed to back off, he knew how to make that happen too. People called him the Fixer, and for 2 decades he lived up to the title. He became close friends with stars like George Raft, Frank Sinatra, and even producers who pretended not to know who he really was. He attended premieres, charity balls, and private dinners. He was always on the guest list, and never in the headlines. When Las Vegas began booming in the 1940s and 50s, Rosselli became the bridge between Hollywood's investors and the mob's casino bosses. He arranged deals for entertainers, brought movie stars to perform in mob-owned hotels, and ensured everyone walked away happy, or at least quiet. Even the FBI admitted they couldn't touch him. He was too sophisticated, too careful, too charming. Agents described him as the gentleman gangster. But what made Rosselli truly dangerous wasn't what he did. It was what he knew. He had dirt on everyone. Studio heads who took bribes, actors who owed gambling debts, politicians who looked the other way. He could destroy careers with a single conversation, and everyone knew it. By the 1960s, Rosselli's connections reached far beyond Hollywood. He worked with the CIA during the Cold War, helping with operations that blurred the line between patriotism and crime. In those years, he was no longer just fixing deals for studios. He was navigating the intersection of power itself, entertainment, politics, and espionage. But no one stays untouchable forever. By the 1970s, the world had changed. New crime bosses didn't value subtlety, they valued obedience. The FBI's pressure mounted, and old alliances crumbled. Rosselli's name resurfaced in Senate hearings investigating organized crime. And suddenly, the man who once knew everything was being asked to explain it. He cooperated, carefully. But in the mob, careful isn't always enough. In 1976, Johnny Rosselli vanished. A few weeks later, a fisherman near Miami discovered a metal drum floating in the bay. Inside was Rosselli's body. The message was clear. The fixer had finally run out of favors. His death shocked Hollywood, not because anyone was surprised, but because it reminded them how deep the old connection still ran. The polite man who had walked every red carpet had been living in two worlds all along. Johnny Rosselli was the quiet architect of a dangerous alliance, the man who kept Hollywood's hands clean while the mob counted the profits. He had built bridges where no one else could, and in the end, it was those same bridges that led him to the water. He knew too much, and in Hollywood, that's never a good ending. Mickey Cohen, the king of Los Angeles. Mickey Cohen wasn't born into the Hollywood dream. He took it. In a city obsessed with fame, he understood that power wasn't about who you were, but who you could reach. By the time the 1940s began, Los Angeles didn't belong to the movie moguls or the politicians. It belonged to him. He started small, a boxer turned bookmaker, a street enforcer turned businessman. But where others saw risk, Cohen saw opportunity. Hollywood was full of people who needed protection, from gossip, from debt, from themselves. And Mickey Cohen was always willing to help for a price. He ran his empire from a tailor shop on Sunset Boulevard, a front that welcomed everyone, from studio executives to movie stars. Behind the curtains, it was something else entirely, a nerve center of extortion, gambling, and influence that reached all the way into City Hall. He paid off police, controlled unions, and decided who got to operate where. In Los Angeles, nothing happened without his approval. To the press, Cohen was a spectacle. He wore $1,000 suits, drove Cadillacs, and gave interviews as if he were a movie star himself. And in a way, he was, a celebrity gangster, perfectly cast for Hollywood's obsession with bad men who look good. But his real power came from his relationships. He was close to actors like George Raft and singers like Frank Sinatra, men who moved between legitimate fame and the shadow world that financed it. He hosted parties that blurred the line between criminal and cultural elite. At his gatherings, you might see a senator, a producer, and a hitman sitting at the same table, laughing about the same headlines. Cohen didn't just enjoy the attention, he used it. He controlled nightclubs that doubled as safe havens for Hollywood's biggest secrets. If a scandal needed to disappear, Cohen could make it happen. If a reporter dug too deep, he could make them stop. He wasn't just feared, he was necessary. But every empire draws enemies. After World War II, the FBI intensified its pursuit of organized crime. Wiretaps, raids, and testimonies began peeling away Cohen's protective layers. He became too visible, too noisy, too powerful for the men who preferred silence. In 1951, federal agents raided his home in Beverly Hills. Television crews arrived to film the arrest. The once untouchable king of Los Angeles in handcuffs under the bright California sun. The city that had once admired him now watched him fall. Cohen served time for tax evasion, the same charge that brought down Al Capone. But prison didn't destroy him. He returned to Los Angeles after his release, older but unbroken, and found that people still lined up to meet him. Reporters, actors, and fans treated him like a relic from a glamorous, dangerous past. He signed autographs, gave interviews, and even published his memoirs. He called himself a businessman, not a gangster. And in a sense, he was right. He had turned crime into an industry built on image as much as intimidation. By the time he died in 1976, Mickey Cohen had outlived most of his rivals and nearly every one of his protected friends. Hollywood had changed, but his fingerprints were still everywhere. In the way power operated behind the scenes, in the unspoken deals between studios and their investors, in the idea that fame could be negotiated like a contract. He once told a reporter, "I never shot a movie, but Hollywood still ran through me." He wasn't lying. Mickey Cohen had mastered the one rule of Los Angeles. If you couldn't be a star, you could always own the stars who needed you. When the spotlight fades, what remains is the silence, and the ghosts of those who once lived under its heat. They chased freedom in a world built on control, and each of them paid the price in their own way. The women who sought independence were crushed by the men who protected them. The men who knew too much vanished before they could speak, and the system that consumed them all kept shining, untouched. But their stories survived, whispered through time, hidden in film reels and forgotten interviews. Because no matter how tightly Hollywood tried to guard its secrets, the truth always finds a way to escape. This is the legacy of power, illusion, and sacrifice. This is the real cost behind the dream. This is the price of liberation.